Welcome back to the Dershow. Obviously, the news has been dominated by all these attacks, counterattacks, defenses relating to the disclosure of the plans to bomb the Houthis. Um, the one issue that hasn't been discussed, I just wrote an op-ed piece on it, and I submitted it. It hasn't been published yet. Asking the following question: what would you have done if you had been the journalist and suddenly you notice you're getting all these chats from the highest government officials in the United States, and they're talking about deep, dark secrets? I tell you what I would have done. I would have immediately called the proper authorities in the government and said, by the way, you probably don't know this, but I'm on your chat list and I shouldn't be. So please take me off it. I'm going to destroy all the things you sent me because I received them improperly. I've actually had that experience in a much less important and but related context. On a couple of occasions, I've been involved with cases, and there have been emails with people on all sides of the case. Sometimes you have to come up with scheduling issues. So you have an email chain with both the plaintiff's lawyers and the defendant's lawyers, with the government's lawyers and the defendant's lawyers. And on at least two occasions that I can remember, I got emails that were intended for people on the opposing team. And here I am getting an email from my opponents. And I didn't think for a second. I just immediately called my opponents and said, you accidentally sent me an email that I shouldn't have gotten. I haven't read it. I've just saw who it was from. I've destroyed it. And please take me off the email list. I remembered the former Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, back way in the day, when he was given information from one of the countries that was opposed to the United States that was surreptitiously obtained. And he said, no, I don't want to see it. Gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail. Now, obviously, that's not true in the context of intelligence gathering and spycraft. But my ethics are such that even though I would have benefited from being on the chain and listening to the opposing side, planning its strategy, I don't think it would have been moral. And so I immediately responded and asked to be taken off the chain. They were embarrassed. They were horrified. But I told them I didn't read it, and I didn't read it. And that's what I would have done. And that's what I would have done if I had been Jeffrey Goldberg. As soon as I realized that I was on a chat chain that I shouldn't have been on, I would have gotten myself off that chain. I wouldn't have waited. Let's see what they have to say today. Let's see what they have to say tomorrow. Wow, they're going to bomb the Houthis. That's interesting. Well, yeah, I don't know if it's true or not. Maybe it's a ploy, but I'm certainly going to stay on the chain. It will help me as a journalist. Well, the ends don't always justify the means. And of course, the job of the journalist is to gather as much information as possible, but by ethical and honest means. And so I think a little bit, look, the primary blame for this has to be on the person or persons who authorized, I'm sure, inadvertently, having an opponent. And remember, Jeff Goldberg works for the Atlantic, which is an anti-Trump, virulently anti-Trump, very pro-democratic magazine. I've written for them. I know. Have your enemy basically having access to national security information. Again, if I were Goldberg, I would have gotten myself off the chain. Now, there are two possible responses to this issue. One is to have journalists come up with an ethical rule that says if you're inadvertently put on a chain, get off it. Don't use it to gather information. I can't count. Journalistic ethics talk about oxymorons. But I don't think that's going to happen. The other is Congress could pass a law saying if you know that or strongly suspect that you are the recipient of an improper national security message that wasn't intended for you, you are obligated to report that. That could be a statute. That is constitutional, and it doesn't interfere with anybody's First Amendment rights. I don't think the decision should be left to the discretion of individual journalists who may not be unbiased, as this guy apparently is not necessarily unbiased. Okay, so that's my take on that. And today, the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, a court on which I clerked 100 years ago, not quite, but 60 years ago, 62 years ago, something like that, um, affirmed the lower court decision not to permit any more airplane flights with deportees to go to El Salvador. The decision was 2-1, with Trump appointed judge dissenting on procedural grounds, and the other two judges saying yes, you can keep that stay in effect so nobody gets deported anymore in the way that these Venezuelans got deported. The dissenting view was on the ground that this case should not be before the D.C. court at all. It should be before the Texas court. That's the last place in the United States that the deportees were before they were sent to El Salvador. So that's the status there. Ultimately, the case will be decided on the merits, and eventually I think it will probably get to the United States Supreme Court. And I think the power of the president to order deportation with due process will be upheld. So my prediction is a divided one. Substantively, the power of the president will be upheld. Procedurally, they'll have to get due process. And the remaining question is, do federal courts have the power to enforce due process against the wishes of the executive, or is this purely an executive function? The Congress could pass a law removing jurisdiction from the federal district courts on issues like this, but they haven't done so. So stay tuned to my continuing legal seminar. All right, speaking of the legal seminar, today we're going to talk about guns, but we're not going to talk about the Second Amendment. That's going to be strange. We're going to be talking about guns, gun laws, and restrictions on guns, but not the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment is really not directly involved in the case that was decided today. The Supreme Court decided today in a 7-2 decision, written by Gorsuch, who's pretty conservative, pretty Republican, pretty right-wing, with dissents by Alito and Thomas, saying that the law and the regulations that require regulation of ghost guns, you know what a ghost gun is? A ghost gun is a kit. What they talked about, any of it. They talked about a kit where you can go online basically and buy the components to a very deadly, lethal gun that you can then put together, and the components aren't registered, and the person buying the components doesn't have to go through checks or register, and the government has no way of really tracing a ghost gun because it has no hallmarks that permit tracing. And so regulations have been enacted requiring some degree of regulation, a serial number, a license for the person who sells the kits, and in some instances, background checks. And so the question before the court was not whether it's constitutional, because the court has already held that it is constitutional to have some regulations on gun ownership, but those regulations only apply to firearms. And the question is, are the ghost components of a kit a firearm? And Alito says, no, it's like if you put on the table the egg, the bacon, the spinach, the mushrooms, is that an omelet? Well, that's a little bit semantic. And of course, the Second Amendment itself is so badly drafted. Here's what the Second Amendment says: a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, if the second sentence is part of the sentence were only in it, it would be a simple matter of interpretation. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And supporters of a narrow reading or a gun permissible reading of the Second Amendment just eliminate the first part of it. They just say the only part that's important is the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The first part that says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state is only a preliminary kind of heuristic statement, much like the Fourth Amendment that says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects shall not be violated. But it is different because in the Fourth Amendment, that really matters. But for Second Amendment advocates who really are against any degree of gun control, they simply read out a well-regulated militia. Now, I've made the argument, I've made it on the show, and there's been a lot of opposition to it, and pretty intelligent opposition. I say that well-regulated, the first three words, a well-regulated, modifies the whole Second Amendment. That is, the right to own guns is subject to being well regulated. They read it differently. They say, no. Militias had to be well regulated in 1790, whenever. All it meant was it had to be under the control of the governor and the state. That's what well regulated means. It's ambiguous. And I think the better and more sensible reading, and really the reading the Supreme Court has accepted, not necessarily my interpretation of a well-regulated militia, but they have said, subsequent to the decision applying the Second Amendment contemporarily to gun ownership and to the states, they've said that you can have regulations. You can prevent people from bringing guns into schools or into crowded areas or maybe into Times Square. I mean, there's big disputes about all of that, but the Supreme Court has so far said you can have some degree of regulation, as you can with free speech. Free speech, it also says Congress shall make no law. It doesn't even give a reason, just no law. And of course, Congress makes laws all the time regulating free speech. You can't blast speakers into the night. I had this myself on the beach here in Florida. Just a few days ago, I was sitting on the beach reading and relaxing, and this idiot sets up an enormous speaker system, like in a club, right next to me, and starts blasting, music into my ears. And I went over and I asked him, could you just lower it or move? No, it's my beach as much as yours. But there are regulations for time, place, and manner. So there are regulations of free speech, even though the Constitution says Congress shall make no law. And there are regulations permitted for gun ownership and gun sales. So the question in this case was whether or not the regulation was intended to and covered the regulation, which talks about regulating firearms and guns. Does that include the components of guns, the kits? I would have thought that would be a pretty easy question, particularly since some of the kits basically take a half an hour to assemble. You go and you buy the components of the gun, you screw a couple of things in, you got a gun that can kill people. It doesn't take a lot of talent or even time to turn the kit into a gun. I remember when a cousin of mine spent weeks making me, for my wedding, it's a wedding gift, making me a stereo system. It never worked very well, but he had a kit. And the kit was, contained like 1,000 little parts. And he was a hobbyist who would weld and do all that stuff and create the kit. Now, that's a real kit. But when you send somebody a gun that's basically in 3 parts and all you have to do is screw them together, calling it a kit doesn't really seem to solve the problem. So the Supreme Court, in a 7-2 decision with concurrences and dissents and all of that, because anytime you mention guns, there are going to be concurrences and dissents, and you always know you're going to get an opinion by Justice Thomas, who I think believes that the right to own guns is the most important right under the Constitution. I've never thought that. I remember Hollywood, what was his name, star, in one of the films, take this gun out of my cold, dead hands. And he said also that the Second Amendment was more important than the First Amendment, because without a Second Amendment, you wouldn't have a First Amendment. Well, there are a lot of countries in the world have First Amendments without Second Amendments. We're the only country in the world with the Second Amendment. I think one other country, maybe Switzerland, has some sort of a constitutional right to own guns for certain purposes, but mm, the vast majority of countries with free speech and with generally an approach to liberty and freedom don't constitutionalize the right to own guns by legislation. They do, they regulate. In Canada, it's very hard to own a gun, but you can. In Israel, which of course is under siege all the time, and soldiers have guns. Little, 18-year-old kids walk around with Uzis strapped on their shoulder. But for a civilian to own a gun is not easy. And somebody will have said, if there had been more guns available on October 7th, that might not have caused the number of disastrous deaths and rapes and beheadings that will cause. So, those are reasonable arguments to have, and, arguments about whether teachers should be able to have guns in the classroom to protect against school shootings. Those are arguments that you can have in the legislature. The question is, what's in the Constitution? Remember, the Constitution, by its very nature, is always going to be an anti-democratic document. If you just operate by democracy, you operate by the majority. Whatever the majority wants, they do. They pass it through legislation. But the Constitution says, no, it doesn't matter what the majority wants. There are certain rights that the majority can't take away from the minority. And the question is, to what extent is ownership of guns part of that very, very limited governmental restrictions on governmental actions? And again, the United States, maybe with Switzerland and maybe one other or two other countries in the world that are Western democracies, have constitutionalized the ownership of guns. In others, it's a matter of legislation. If I were writing the Constitution, I would not put guns in the Constitution at all. I would leave it to the legislature. I'm not in favor of amending the Bill of Rights. I'm not in favor of changing the Second Amendment. I'm in favor of interpreting it in a reasonable manner, and reasonable manner will differ. Many of my viewers and listeners want a much more gun permissive interpretation of the Second Amendment than I do, and it's probably part of my background. I never saw a gun in my life until I went to camp. When I was in camp, my friend was the riflery instructor, so we would go out early in the morning and shoot, practice 22 rifles. But I never held a gun in my life as a kid. We were not hunters. We were gatherers, but we were not hunters. And I brought up in a culture where guns belonged to police, military, and criminals. I didn't know any people who went out hunting, but that's different. Then I went to law school and with a lot of people. And what did you do over Christmas? I went hunting with my dad. I went hunting with my grandfather. With a little fishing, a little hunting. We would fish it. We fished, but we didn't hunt. So it's cultural. Without a doubt, it's cultural. And the framers of the Second Amendment culturally were supportive of guns. There's no doubt about that. The vast majority of American households at the time of the Revolution and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights had guns to protect themselves against marauders and to hunt for food. So no doubt that the original meaning was fairly permissive. But we live in urban centers now, and guns kill, and we can have a debate about it. My own view is that we should have legislative debates about gun control and where guns can be had and where they can't. That it's much better if it not be constitutionalized, but it's in the Constitution. And if we were to amend the Second Amendment, they'd want to amend the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and the Eighth Amendment. I'm happy to have all 10 amendments the way they are without amending any of them. And so I'm going to be a supporter of the Second Amendment, but I'm going to be a supporter of a construction of the First Amendment, which allows reasonable regulation. And for me, the decision today was an easy one on the merits. Of course, the government should be allowed to regulate ghost guns, particularly those that are made from kits that can be put together easily. And if not, it would be the easiest thing in the world to circumvent any kind of regulation. Just, have one screw out and send the gun with a screw and call it a kit. Obviously, that's not what the framers of the regulation had in mind. So that's what the law is today, 7-2 by the Supreme Court, not along partisan lines necessarily. to my mind, the right decision. To the mind of many of you out there, maybe not the right decision. So you'll send me letters, and I'll read them, and we'll have an argument, and we'll talk. We'll talk about it. And speaking of letters, let's turn to them. Uh, Lawyer-client confidentiality is as sacred as the seal of the confessional. As a Catholic, I can tell you that there were priests who chose death rather than break that seal. Such integrity is rare in this day and age. Lawyers, priests, and anyone else should keep anything told to them in confidence, private, only need to pursue social media to realize that confidentiality is all too often breached. I agree with you, and I think journalists have to keep confidence too. I rarely say anything to a journalist off the record. I'm generally willing to put my name and identity behind what I have to say. But if I do say something off the record, I expect the journalist to maintain that confidentiality. And certainly when I speak to presidents and prime ministers and people who I give advice to, it's a one-way street. If they want to reveal my advice, that's fine, but I will never reveal what I told to them. And I tell that to them very clearly, that what I tell them is confidential. No, the signal disaster is not analogous to an email reply or a mistake. No, of course not. For a period of days, all the officials in the chat did not know who they were talking to. No one bothered to confirm who was in attendance. The journalist wasn't hiding. He was out in the open. No, he was hiding. I don't agree with that. If you're on a chat and you know you're not supposed to be on that chat, just sitting there silently is not being out in the open. He should have started the chat by saying, by the way, I'm the editor of The Atlantic. I'm on this chat. I'm sure you don't realize that. So would you stop the chat and take me off the chat? And then you can continue to operate in confidence. That's what I would have done. But I'm not him. So, all right. This is a nice one. Alan and Jordan Peterson at dinner. Average IQ 190, I wish. I wish I were there. It would have been fun. It was fun. He was very good, very funny, and very smart and very knowledgeable. I thought I knew a tremendous amount about the Old Testament. I've written several books on it, and I've studied the Old Testament very carefully. And we had some good arguments about the interpretation of the Old Testament and arguing with God and whether the God of the Old Testament is a perfect God or an imperfect God. I argued that God admits after he sees all the terrible things that are happening in the earth, he says, I regret having created human beings. How does a perfect God ever regret anything? He should have known in advance what was going to happen. So, you can have these arguments. The Jewish view of God is very different from the Christian view of God. The Jewish view of prophets like Moses and David is very different from the Christian view of saints, and even the Christian view of Jesus, who was perfect. So we had some very, very interesting and good arguments over a good meal. No wine. He doesn't drink wine, so I didn't drink wine. But I had a good time, and I went and heard him speak, and it was very interesting. The crowds were amazing, and the applause, sustained applause, everything he said was absolutely remarkable. So it was a great evening. I really enjoyed it. In your speech, you were correct to refer to Chelsea Manning as he when referring to his early years, and then, so I agree with that. But then the next sentence is, you also should have referred to him as he when referring to him in his later years. Despite wishful thinking by some, sex can't be changed. Yes, it can. We control our own destiny. If you want to change who you are, you can change who you are. It doesn't mean you can play volleyball against people who were born into a different gender. That's a different issue. But do you want to call yourself Chelsea? You want to be a woman? You want to live your life as a woman? None of my effing business. We can have rules about which bathrooms you can go to. We should have single gender bathrooms. Just everybody gets in their own little room. But you have the right to decide how do you want to live your life. You want to live your life in a different gender that you were born in, go ahead, do it, as long as it doesn't affect me. And that's not me speaking. That's John Stuart Mill. That's Jeremy Bentham. That's every great libertarian philosopher. And if you're a libertarian, you have to support transgender rights. You don't have to support bathrooms. You don't have to support sports, but you have to support the right of a person born into one gender to change into another gender, Even, it's interesting. The Bible doesn't really talk about that, but the Talmud, which is the Jewish interpretation of the Bible, lists 5 genders, maybe 6, I don't remember. This is in the 2nd century BC, and it lists hermaphrodites, it lists people, but it goes through the various possibilities of biological continuum between man and woman. It was very, very, very sensitive. So I've never believed the nonsense. God created you in 2 sexes. There are only 2 sexes. No. You choose what you want to do. You choose your religion. You can't choose your race. You can do something about it. You can disguise your race. But you can choose your gender within limits. And you have to be old enough, and you have to be willing and able to consent, and it has to not do harm to anybody else. But if all of those conditions are satisfied, not my business. Okay. All right. This is about once a day I get this letter, so I have to read it because I have to respond. I'm entitled to respond. This lying lawyer needs to keep his ass out of jail after all the truth, sleeping with kids on famous islands. So Jeffrey Epstein's island once, well, it wasn't even built up. He had just bought it. My wife, my daughter, and I were on an adjoining island for a vacation. He sent the plane, asked us to come see it. We had dinner that night. There's nobody on the island except repair people. We were there one day. A famous professor came and joined us for dinner. We had dinner, purely adults. That was the end of it. Never again on that island. And so I have nothing to apologize for. Not going to jail. Believe me, not going to jail. Maybe the people who falsely accused me, that may be a different issue, but I'm not going to jail. Dersh, I recently watched Otto Preming's Anatomy of a Murder, which I love. Do you have a favorite movie about the law? Of course I do. It's called Reversal of Fortune. My son Elon, the producer of the show, was the producer of Reversal of Fortune, Jeremy Irons, Glenn Close. I think it's one of the best movies about law ever made. Let me tell you a movie I don't like, and people will be shocked. I don't like To Kill a Mockingbird. I didn't like the book. I don't like the movie. The movie is actually in some ways better than the book. Why don't I like it? I don't like the thesis of the book. It's all about defending somebody who turns out innocent, and he's a hero. He's not a hero if you turn out somebody who's innocent. You're a hero if you represent somebody who may very well be guilty, or who you believe is guilty, or who is in fact guilty. That really is what tests the system. So I would have much preferred to see To Kill a Mockingbird have the person who Atticus Finch represents turn out to be guilty. It's too easy to be a hero when you represent an innocent person. In my career, I've represented innocent people. It's been great. But the majority of people that any criminal lawyer represents are guilty. And I'm not going to tell you which ones are guilty and which ones were innocent because I have lawyer-client privilege to maintain. But I am going to tell you that the job of the criminal defense lawyer is not to be the hero who represents only innocent people. If so, there'd be hardly any criminal defense lawyers around because there aren't that many innocent people who are charged with serious crimes. So it's my job to defend the guilty in order to prevent the innocent from being prosecuted. Love to represent the innocent, like it much better than representing the guilty. Sleep a little better at night when I do that, but I'm going to continue to represent the guilty along with the innocent and never to tell you who is who. See you next week.